couple people request whether we could do this on Friday night instead of Friday morning. So this is going to be about a 50-minute session in which I answer your questions here on TikTok. I'm also going live on YouTube at the very same time. So if you're not on TikTok, hello, hope you enjoyed the YouTube live stream. We now have a camera that actually can record proper video and audio. So I'm going to take about 50 minutes to sort of answer your questions and discuss. This is going to be a 50-minute session, and I want to sort of comment on a couple of the videos that I've recorded over the last couple of days, all of which have pretty much revolved around the theme of love. So basically, we're going to have a session today in which I talk about various philosophical conceptions of love, and hopefully that will be interesting and informative for you. Now, I briefly want to introduce myself and the project here. If you're joining us for the very first time, welcome to our learning community. It's wonderful to have you join us. I teach a weekly Monday morning class on Instagram Live and on YouTube. We're currently finishing up a lecture series called If You Really Love Nothing, a lecture series on the topic of nothingness and on love. It's also an introduction to the work of Zizek and dialectics. So if you would like to join one of these classes, you can join us every Monday at 8 a.m. USA Pacific, or you can find the recorded version on my Instagram, what is it called, IGTV, or you can go to YouTube. YouTube channel is called Intro to Philosophy. Okay, that's enough introduction. Hello, everybody on TikTok and on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining me this Friday evening. Now, one of the videos had a little piece about how Zizek conceptualizes love. And I thought it might be interesting for you and perhaps for me if I clarified that just a little bit. Because basically Zizek, and he's always being provocative, right? You have to understand that. Zizek is saying that love is violent. And he says love is, in a sense, not just violent, but it's also in a deeply disruptive force. And so I want to help you explain. I want to explain a little bit why Zizek says that love is violent. And he goes even a step further, right? He says it's not just that love is violent. He also says that love is evil. Okay, so here we have a lot of, like, let's say, pretty based approach to love. The idea that love is violent and love is evil. And in this sense, like when he uses the word evil here, it's almost like very much in this sort of, I think it was Kafka who said that evil is the dialogue. In other words, in dialogue is sort of where evil emerges, like how people punish each other by means of their interpretation and misinterpretation of each other. But what Zizek has in mind here when he says that love is evil is what I'm going to try to explain in the next 45 minutes or so. Now, why does Zizek say that love is evil or violent, right? It's because he's trying to emphasize the disruptive force of love. The way in which when you're in love, you turn away from the world and you focus on that very small sort of tunnel vision in which you can't enjoy the day-to-day things anymore. You only want to be with that other person. Now, the reason that Zizek refers to this as a violent process is because he's actually making a meta reference to Hegel. And Zizek often says that Hegel is the philosopher of love. And the reason that Hegel is the philosopher of love is because Hegel is the philosopher of historic disruption, of the way in which, if you imagine history to be like a record, to use a very old-fashioned reference, it's like when there's a record skip. Because one of the ideas that Hegel has is that history basically moves forward in pretty much like a linear fashion. Like it just sort of moves at a gradual pace. And every once in a while, there's something that takes place in which history lurches. Like it basically moves forward. There's sort of like a jump, and everybody has to adjust to that moment. You can think, for example, about the pandemic, right? In a sense, everything is moving forward in history. And then there's this sort of external event, this thing that nobody saw coming, and at the same time, everybody could have seen coming, which is the pandemic. And then suddenly everybody has to adjust to that new reality. And Hegel basically has this idea that love and history move in the same way, which is that you're sort of slowly moving forward in your. So one day there's this massive disruption. It's like the encounter with somebody, like the flash of lightning, love on first sight experience. And then all of a sudden you're spending all your energy trying to adjust to this new reality, the new reality in which you have fallen in love. And so Hegel has this metaphor that I think you might find interesting. Hegel says that it's a little bit like when you're the transition when you're like in uterus, when you're not yet born versus when you're born. He says you spend 9 months in gestation. So you're basically 9 months until you're born, obvious. And then all of a sudden you're sort of thrown out into the world, right? You are born. And that moment of being born is, of course, not synonymous with having lived. In a sense, it's the starting point of your life to come. It's like that pure moment of potential. And so this is the metaphor that Zizek has in mind when he says that love is violent. It's like a disruptive force. You're basically you're going through life, you're going through history, or you're in the womb, you're sort of gradually moving forward. And then all of a sudden there's this massive lurch, this like event that changes the way in which you experience reality. And so when people on TikTok saw my video about Zizek saying that love is violent and love is evil, of course, a lot of people said, who damaged Zizek and why does Zizek have to be so negative? But the truth is that the idea that Zizek has about love is actually deeply romantic in a sense, right? It's actually giving love more meaning than other philosophers would. Because it's not just the idea that love is like a supplement, it's like, okay, it's nice to be in love, etc. It's the idea that love completely changes the entire framework in which you see reality. And what's key here is that Zizek isn't saying that it actually changes reality. Because if you're in love, you may see the world differently, but nobody else sees the world differently. It's like for everybody else, their life just sort of continues. So what you're doing is that you have suddenly created this shift where you start seeing everything differently in the world. Now, the reason that Zizek says that that is not only a violent upheaval, but also an evil upheaval is because what Zizek has in mind is that basically before you fall in love, you're relatively happy in the world. You're just sort of, you enjoy the little pleasures of life. And then as soon as you fall in love, you're basically faced with a binary choice, which is either I manage to be with this person and I am happy and I feel complete, or I'm not with this person and I'm deeply miserable. Because let's say, for example, that what you really like is to play video games, and that's sort of everything for you and you're perfectly happy playing video games. And then suddenly you fall in love, and what was previously very satisfying to you, playing video games, suddenly seems sort of hollow and empty until you're able to find that person, and then potentially you could enjoy playing video games together. And that's what Zizek means when he says that love is evil. He's not saying that like love is necessarily like something very bad, but it's something that is perceived as an external force that comes into our life and that sort of has to be expunged in one way or another. It's kind of funny when you go back to like medieval history and you realize that that language was a little bit more common. For example, the priests, or not the priests, like the pharmacists who would travel throughout, medieval times would basically specialize in two things. One, abortions, and two, exorcisms, because the idea of an abortion and the idea of an exorcism was sort of seen as being fairly similar. It's like, here's this unwanted thing that is intruded into your life, and I am the specialist who can sort of expel it for you. And that's the kind of language that Zizek has in mind here. When he says it's evil, he means that it's perceived as coming from without. In other words, Zizek doesn't really believe that love comes from within, that it's always already inside of you, like Christian agape or something. Instead, Zizek sees love very much as this external thing that suddenly like comes into your life and reframes everything that you thought you knew until then. Now, if you want to use the term from Alain Badiou, who's another influence on Zizek's work, Badiou would say that love in this way is an event capital E, because an event again is something that sort of happens like Suddenly you're just in this peaceful realm, and then suddenly something happens to you, and the event has completely shifted your life. Like you're never the same again. And this is actually like not that unusual of an idea. If you've ever watched a Studio Ghibli movie, for example, most Studio Ghibli movies have this structure, which is that you have a protagonist who has an encounter with a female protagonist, and like suddenly everything is changed for him. And that's actually something that Miyazaki has talked about quite a lot, that like for him, the central part of every one of his films is that moment in which the male character meets a female character, and suddenly everything has changed. They see the world completely differently. And not just the world, like they see ethics differently. Like mostly, if you go back and you watch Miyazaki's films, the encounter with the female protagonist usually initiates a crisis, which is a crisis of morality for the character. Like if you watch Princess Mononoke, there's that scene, and you probably find this on YouTube, the scene where the male character sees Princess Mononoke for the very first time. And it's like, it's not love at first, love as in like they're going to kiss at the end of the movie and there's going to be that romantic, happy ending. It's the kind of love that just changes everything that they thought they knew. It's like an electric current that runs through every fiber of their being. And this is exactly the kind of violence that Zizek has in mind when he talks about love being both violent and evil. And so that's something that I want to keep in mind, sort of build the argument a little bit. Thank you for everybody who's still in this live stream. I want you to know that I try to do these, teach these in a dialectical fashion. What I mean by that is that technically you should be able to enjoy this live stream at any point that you sort of enter. I hope that all the themes will kind of weave through each other and repeat themselves. Okay, so I want to briefly think about love beyond just, loving somebody, because obviously there's more ways to love than to just fall in love. Like the falling in love is sort of key here, right? It's that banana peel moment where you're just kind of walking, you're going through life, and then before you know it, you're just head over heels, right? I mean, we have all these expressions to basically designate the inconvenience of love and the way in which love is traumatic in that way, right? It's sort of this thing that really disrupts your life. And in a sense, it would be much more peaceful in which you don't fall in love. And so in a sense, we're doomed to love, but we're also happily doomed to love. This is also why Socrates, for example, referred to love as a divine form of madness, or if you sort of want to update it, like a crazy wisdom. And he says it's a crazy wisdom. Love is a crazy wisdom because it makes you both really foolish, really irrational. In other words, it brings out all the worst parts of your personality. You become jealous, you become spiteful, you become paranoid, you become narcissistic, right? That's basically the Socratic idea of divine madness. And at the same time, you become really, really clever, because falling in love means that you're essentially very, very clever at figuring out how to impress that person or how to make a good, impression on that kind of person. So this is the Socratic idea of love. But if we detach that from just a person being the object of love, you realize that in a very Freudian way, you could also fall in love with the idea of falling in love. And this is where, from like a Freudian Lacanian perspective, love is always autoerotic. When we're in love, we like the idea of being in love. We enjoy the process of being in love, and we enjoy us being in love. In other words, we fall in love with the idea of love itself. And if you take that even one step further, and I don't know if this is a reference that makes sense to many people on TikTok, but if you look, for example, at the opera Don Giovanni, in Don Giovanni, the titular character, Don Giovanni, has an infamous list. And this is a list of all of the women he has slept with. And it's not just that he has a list of like, here's how many women I've slept with. He has this economy of the types of women he slept with. So Don Giovanni, the titular character in the opera, has this list where he says, I've slept with old women, I've slept with young women, I've slept with beautiful women. He basically objectifies women in like the crudest fashion. But of course, what we realize as we watch this opera is that Don Giovanni is not really in love with any of the women. He's also not really in love with himself. Don Giovanni is in love with the list itself, right? Don Giovanni is in love with the list. He's in love with the pursuit of women, which of course isn't really a love in and of itself. He's simply obsessed with this idea of creating the list. And so, of course, at that point, like, it's a lot of work to do that. And in a sense, Don Giovanni isn't even enjoying his romantic encounters anymore. It's become this obsession that he has to do. He has to work on the list, and he has an assistant who sort of works on the list for him. And so there's this masochistic part of love as well, right? So it's not just loving another person. It's not just loving yourself. It's also the process of loving the idea of loving. In this case, loving the idea of the list. And this is what, in psychoanalytic terms, we would say is also masochistic. In a sense, he enjoys the process of not loving. He loves the process of not loving and of not feeling love. For him, for Don Giovanni, love is a form of self-flagellation. And so love, very quickly, as you can tell, becomes like quite a complicated thing here. There's a film that I really, really like because, and I'm going to tell you what it is. It is Phantom Thread, the film Phantom Thread. And Phantom Thread is a neat film because it's actually one of the few films, at least few English films that I can think of, that focuses on a masochistic love relationship. And this is almost like if you go to Sartre, for example, right? So Sartre has this idea that love is conflict, and he leads you again to the masochistic part of love. There are certain lovers who enjoy tormenting each other. Because if you think about it, what lovers can do better than anybody else is torture each other. When you're in love and when you're in a relationship, you learn better than anyone how to get under that person's skin. And this is sort of the Sartrean idea of love as perpetual conflict. It's like you've chosen this one person to have conflicts with. So back to the movie Phantom Thread. In the movie Phantom Thread, we have a man who's a tailor who seems incapable of love. He basically got of different women. He has this incapability of being in a long-term relationship. And many of the women, he sort of just grows bored with them, and then he treats them horribly until they reach a point where they no longer want to be with him. And there's one woman, this woman, her name is Alma, which also means soul. Alma is the Phantom Thread love interest who reverses this twisted love relationship. So on the one hand, she's the object of his love. She's like a muse to the to the main character. And at the same time, she figures out how she can make that relationship be a long-lasting one. Spoilers, it's a masochistic relationship. Now, one of the things that we find out in Phantom Thread is that every once in a while, the main character becomes violently ill. He sort of like has like a stomach bug, like he's vomiting and he's in bed. And it's in these moments when he's most tender with Alma, with his lover, basically. He's no longer brutal to her. He treats her like a mother figure, essentially, and she gets to nurse him. In other words, the power relationship of their courtship has changed. Usually he's the dominant figure and she is the muse, and then he becomes sick, and then she can take care of him, and she's the more authoritarian figure, and he enjoys the process of being sort of mothered by her. Okay, so this is how the movie progresses, and we basically think, okay, you know, he's getting sick, and apparently, you know, they get along when he's sick. Seems weird, but fine. Then we start becoming suspicious when we're watching this movie, which is, wait, what if Alma, to get revenge at him and realizing that he is a better partner to her when he's ill, what if she might be poisoning him? What if she's actually creating the conditions for him to become sick? And so in our own minds, watching this movie, we already have a very, let's say, non-Hollywood narrative, which is, could it be that she's poisoning him so that he will basically be nice to her? Which seems sort of messed up, but okay, we could imagine it. And then we're talking about Phantom Thread right now. And in the final scene of Phantom Thread, spoilers for Phantom Thread, in the final scene, we think that we have our suspicions confirmed. We see a scene in which she is making a soup. It's a mushroom soup, and we've watched her pick what we know to be a poison mushroom. And so as the audience, we think to ourselves, aha, we found this point where she's poisoning him so that she can influence him and make him show affection to her. We feel like we've seen through her. But the joke is on us, because what we did not realize as an audience when you're watching this movie, again, spoilers for Phantom Thread, what we didn't realize is that it is a masochistic relationship. And what do you need for a masochistic relationship? Not one person being in on the game, but both people have to be in on the game. It's like a dominatrix relationship. And so what happens in the final scene of Phantom Thread is we're watching a scene in which we think that the woman is poisoning the man so that she can manipulate him. And then as soon as he takes a sip of the soup that we know to be poisoned, he looks at her and he says to her, and this is like one of the most vulgar scenes in the history of contemporary cinema. He looks at her after taking a sip of the soup. You can find this if you go to YouTube and you type in Phantom Thread soup or whatever. He looks at her and he says, "Kiss me before I'm sick. Kiss me before I'm sick." And so in that moment, in that expression, we realize that all along he was in on the game. In other words, he enjoys being poisoned by Alma. He enjoys being sick. And worse, and this is what makes it properly vulgar, and worse, he is turned on by the fact that she is poisoning him. In other words, we have here the most beautiful example of a properly masochistic relationship. It's the enjoyment of, as someone says in the comments, the enjoyment of being the victim. It's the giving away of your autonomy, of your personhood, and relishing in being objectivized by someone else. And so we've gone through a really interesting narrative in Phantom Thread. We start out with like the classic Hollywood narrative, which is, authoritative, handsome man who's a well-respected professional. He meets a beautiful woman and she becomes his muse, and he's going to sort of educate her, as like kind of like the Pretty Woman situation. And then we go into the second narrative, which is the paranoid narrative, in which we're still objectivizing the woman. The idea is, oh, well, maybe she's poisoning him because when he's poisoned, she can take care of him and he's more loving. And then finally, we end up in the final scene, spoilers, we end up with Phantom Thread with a properly masochistic relationship. In other words, we realize that the two of them are deliberately making each other miserable because they enjoy the process of that suffering. And so it's a very Sartrean idea of love, the idea of love as conflict. If you haven't seen Phantom Thread, I very highly recommend it. I know I've just totally spoiled it, but watch Phantom Thread. Okay, so if you're still joining us, we are talking about the reasons why Zizek, the philosopher, sort of communist philosopher extraordinaire, Zizek says that love is violent. Because when he says that love is violent, he's not actually saying that you shouldn't fall in love, and he's not saying that love is necessarily a bad thing. He's pointing towards the complexities of love and the way in which love is also a violent upheaval of the way in which you see your world. Okay, so in the beginning of this video, I talked a little bit about Hegel. And Zizek always says that Hegel is the philosopher of love. Now, this isn't because Hegel writes very much about love. It's because Hegel uses love almost like a metaphor for the idea of progress and history. Because Hegel basically says that history moves forward on a continuum, and then every once in a while there's this lurch, there's like the record skip, there's this moment, and it can be triggered by a person in which suddenly history seems to be moving not just at an accelerated pace, but in a way that seems very unprecedented. And so history then becomes us trying to cope with this new reality. And so for Hegel, it's not that reality changes, it's that we're constantly trying to catch up with changes in reality. We're constantly trying to wrap our head around what has just happened. And for Zizek, this is basically the same metaphor for love. When you go through your day-to-day life, you encounter someone seemingly out of the blue who suddenly changes the way in which you see everything. It sort of fundamentally alters the basic coordinates of what you thought was life. And this is the metaphor that Zizek uses when he says that love is violent. Okay, I want to introduce one more, let's say, reference to love here, if you're still with me. One more reference, which is probably one. Okay, first of all, like love is a theme in practically every work of art. So I mean, we could pick anything here. But the one that's perhaps that stands out to me here, and it's very cliche, which is that if you look at Proust's In Search of Lost Time. Now, I'm not asking you to read all of Proust's In Search of Lost Time. This would be a very elaborate affair. I mean, of course, if you enjoy it, you should. But if you were to go to one passage of Proust, I would recommend I think it's the second book of the first volume, because the volumes are like split into sort of miniature books. And this is Swan in Love, Swan in Love, in which we have the character of Swan, not the bird Swan, but a character called Monsieur Swan, who falls in love. And it's an absolutely brutal book. Reading it, I challenge you not to feel some form of recognition, because the way in which Proust writes about love and the torment of love and the way in which love just sort of like ruins who you thought you were as a person is something that I think rings very, very universally true. And again, we're back with the Socratic idea of love being a divine madness or crazy wisdom. It makes you both an utter fool, very predictable, very paranoid, very jealous, very spiteful. It sort of drives you crazy. And at the same time, it's one of the most blissful and sort of addictive experiences in the world. The French theorist Roland Barthes has a similar play on love, where he says that love makes everybody very predictable. And what he's basically saying is that everybody, or most people, I think everybody, but let's say everybody, will at some point fall in love. And when they're in love, they think that what they're experiencing is absolute. Nobody has ever experienced love in the way in which they just have. And yet they're behaving in a totally predictable way that to everybody else seems foolish. It's a little bit like if one of your best friends falls in love and you see him or her or they or whatever partner, it's quite cringy, right? Because what they think that they have is like they think that they're reinventing the idea of love, whereas in a sense, it's very predictable. Like it's a very normal way to act, but everybody feels like they're personally reinventing what it means to be in love. Like they're the only people who have ever been in love, and that they are probably the only ones who will ever fully appreciate. Well, that's what Socrates has in mind when he talks about, I mean, through Plato, when he talks about divine madness. It's like everybody who's in love thinks like they're reinventing the wheel. And at the same time, they're just doing what people have done for millennia and millennia. And that's what's so fun about when you read both Plato, or you even read, much more modern, you read Proust, and you realize that all these emotions and all these intertwined, entangled, contradictory feelings that Proust describes in Search of Lost Time are completely universal. You will probably experience them yourself. And again, we have here again have the idea of love as a very specific type of suffering, as a sort of a blissful agony, as it were. Okay, but back to the book that I have in mind here. So I'm not saying you have to read the entirety of. Okay, there's a comment that I'm really enjoying here. For those of you watching on YouTube, I know you can't see the comments, but there's a comment saying that that these books are all green screen. That's right. It's a perfect green screen of books. Okay, I'm just gonna move aside a little bit. Let's see. Do we need like a brief intermission before we talk about Proust, where we just grab a random stack of books? Shall we do that? Okay. Let's see what happens if we grab a random stack here. All right. Oh, God, these are heavy. Okay. Let's grab a random stack here and see if I have read these, because no, I have not read every one of these books, although I've read parts of most of every book. Okay, so let's see. We have here the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism, which if you're looking to get into probably one of the better texts, I've done a live stream before where I talked about why you should get this one and not the philosophy one. So the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism. This is basically a collection of philosophical texts. Highly recommend. Okay, then we have a collection of poetry right here. My Mother Was a Freedom Fighter by Aya Monet, who is an African, I think an African-American poet, although it might be that she's Caribbean, but I think she's African-American. She has a brutal poem about Obama, which might be fun to do a reading of at some point. So it was actually a gift from my father, a Christmas gift. Here we have Michael Lowy, a book of photography and photography of revolutions, including pictures of the barricades for the Parisian Commune. This is a book of photographs with, I don't know if you can see any of these. Let's see if we can find a good one. A lot of dead people, pretty grim. Here we have the barricades. Here we go, book of photography. Here we have one of my favorite books, which is an English translation of Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, which is a great, what is called Bildungsroman, which is a story about the education of a young man, not like him going to school, but let's call it the trials and tribulations of someone coming into adulthood into a bourgeois family, the Buddenbrooks. It's also, the subtitle is The Decline of a Family. This is an incredible book. I highly, highly recommend it. What do we have? We have an Oxford very short introduction to democracy. We have one to German philosophy, and we have one to political philosophy. Now, if you've never heard of these before, these are the Oxford very short introductions. They're about, I don't know, $1 a piece. They're very short. And if you're looking for an introduction to philosophy, this is probably the way to go. Oxford very short introductions. I have like a ridiculous amount of these. I think I have, this is like a, I don't know, this is like a flex, but I think I have like at least 200 of these. At some point, I can show you that collection. They're not in this room. They're in another room. Then we have, oh, this is slightly embarrassing. We have Evelyn Waugh, who is also known as the author of Brideshead Revisited, but this is called A Handful of Dust. Evelyn Waugh writes satirical novels about the British upper crust. However, they're not entirely satirical. They're also a little bit worse. This is Evelyn Waugh. Then we have, oh, this is excellent. I actually did a class on this like half a year ago. This is from a Japanese author called Junichiro Tanizaki. And this is The Secret History of the Lord of Musashi and Arrowroot, 2 short stories. This, you really have to go back to one of my classes. I did a whole class on this. There's an entire story about a young man who becomes erotically obsessed with the severed head of an enemy samurai, and he can only enjoy sex if he has a woman caressing the severed head of the other samurai. Is a very, very twisted, messed up story. So if you're interested in Japanese literature and samurai and the perverted sexual fantasies of severed heads, this is the book for you. This is, let's see, Junichiro Tanizaki. Sort of recommend, sort of. Then we have, this is okay, if you're just joining us, this is a random stack of books that I've taken from the books here to prove that it is not a green screen. Here we have Jean-Paul Sartre, Essays in Existentialism. Of course, Sartre would not necessarily describe himself as an existentialist. I mean, he does, but in different ways than people think he is. What's really good about this, Essays in Existentialism, is not just the cover, which is sort of swanky, but the introduction. The introduction is very, very good. And this is from Citadel Press, which you don't see a lot of books from Citadel Press. Then we have here, gosh, you know, I own this, but I actually don't think that I have read this. This is Marx and Engels' Basic Writings on Politics and Philosophy. Over here, paperback, Marx and Engels, basic writings on politics and philosophy. If you're interested in the relationship between Engels and Marx, you can join one of my classes on YouTube and Instagram every Monday, in which we do quite a bit of Engels and Marx. Okay, we're getting to the end of this stack, if you're still with us. We're getting to the end. Here we have Slavoj Zizek, The Year of Dreaming Dangerously. Now, which year does he have in mind in particular? The year that Slavoj Zizek has in mind is the year 2011. And I think what he's referring to are the Arab Spring protests and the anti-capitalist financial crisis protests in the West. This is also one of Zizek's shorter books, The Year of Dreaming Dangerously. It's the only book of Zizek's that has the man himself on the cover, sort of, coolly walking away from a burning car. And this may be the first Zizek book that I owned, that I read. It's highly polemical. In other words, it's very argumentative and political. And it's quite a good read. So if you're interested in getting started with Zizek, this would actually be I know the image is inverted, but it's called The Year of Dreaming Dangerously. Okay, and then we're almost done. We're going through a stack of books that I've randomly chosen from my collection to prove to you that I actually know what these books are about. Here we have Thomas Frank, The Conquest of Cool. Thomas Frank, who's one of the founding editors of an incredible magazine called The Baffler. If you're interested in reading The Baffler, you can go online and get some of the free articles. I don't know if I have an issue of The Baffler lying around here. Probably not. It is I think it's like a quarterly magazine. I don't think I have an issue right here. Although I could get one for you. Okay, I'm going to get one for you, but you guys have to stick with me. I'm going to get you an issue of The Baffler right now. Okay, I'm back. Thank you for sticking with me. Over here we have, I promised you I would show you The Baffler. The Baffler is a quarterly magazine, and this is a stack of Bafflers right over here. Bafflers, I'm just going to get the first one. The Baffler always has sort of fun covers. This is what it looks like. On the back, they usually have a cartoon. In this case, they have a burning police hat with a sausage being grilled on it. You probably guess that The Baffler is a leftist magazine, but it is not leftist in terms of, let's say, being deeply Marxist, etc. It's mostly cultural criticism. It has art, cartoons. The slogan of The Baffler is particularly good. The slogan of the magazine, The Baffler, is called Blunting the Cutting Edge. So if you want an issue of The Baffler, you can go to the website, The Baffler, read it. And the reason that we're talking about The Baffler is, also, if you get a subscription, they have a hat. And you probably can't read it, but the hat says, "Your lifestyle sucks." You can get the Your Lifestyle Sucks hat if you buy The Baffler. The reason we're talking about The Baffler is because of this book by Thomas Frank. And Thomas Frank is one of the founding editors of The Baffler. He's also a cultural critic. He writes about American culture, the way in which he also writes about religion in the United States and sort of the American obsession with consumerism and capitalism and all that. Here you can see him doing an analysis of car advertisements in the 1950s. So this book is called The Conquest of Cool, Business Culture, Counterculture, and the Rise of Hip Consumerism. Thomas Frank, very fun. Not at all academic. So his style of writing is super engaging, which is very, very interesting. We're getting to the end of this pile. We have another Thomas Mann book in translation, which is The Magic Mountain, which I frequently use in my classes. The Magic Mountain, again, a Bildungsroman. in which a young man goes up to a mountain resort, a spa, and encounters all kinds of lurid and creepy reasons why he convinces himself that he is chronically ill and never has to go back. So The Magic Mountain is a German novel. And finally, one of my very favorite writers, Stefan Zweig. And this is Stefan Zweig's autobiography called The World of Yesterday, in which he writes about pre-war Europe, or Europe, so this is pre-World War II, so interbellum Europe. And sadly, Stefan Zweig and his wife committed suicide shortly after completing this manuscript. It is one of the more melancholic and beautiful descriptions of interwar Europe. Okay, that was the stack. I realize that I have one more thing lying around here, which, if you're interested in magazine recommendations, because I'm an avid reader of what used to be called periodicals or magazines, you could look at Book Forum. Book Forum is the spin-off magazine of Art Forum. Now, Art Forum is one of the most well-known art critic publications, and Book Forum is the literary equivalent of that. In other words, Book Forum is about book reviews and literary analysis. Oh, the last book was The World of Yesterday by Stefan Zweig, which is his autobiography or memoir. It's super, super readable. I read this at least once a year. And it's about interwar Europe and the end of a certain way of life. So it's called The World of Yesterday. And finally, we have here Book Forum, which is a literary magazine, which I actually think is probably the coolest book review magazine. And when I say book review, it's not just like a movie review. It's not saying like 4 out of 5 stars. It's basically standalone essays about books. And this is what it looks like. It's quite large. It's called Book Forum. And I think the subscription is $18 for 1 year, which is a steal. This comes out every 3 months as well. Book Forum. Okay, I love that this kind of got like, this started out as one thing. Yeah, I'm also live on YouTube. Yes, you can join us on YouTube. I'm streaming this to 2 at once. That was kind of fun, actually. Like, I wonder if maybe we should do these TikTok sessions less as classes, which is awkward, and maybe we could just do it more as going through the collection of books and maybe using that as an opportunity to like have discussions about those books. I don't know if that's very interesting. If you're interested in that, that's something that I can do more often. Basically, we just take a random stack of books, and there's more over here. We can take a random stack of books, and we can sort of figure that out. I can sort of talk about them if you want. We just went through a stack of books. Hopefully that's been interesting to you. So we started out this live stream as a discussion about love, in which I sort of, in a very long-winded form, talked about love. But I promised you one last thing, which is I was going to talk about Proust's Swan in Love. That's where we were before we sort of got on this tangent, which I very much enjoy. Okay, someone's asking the question what the Bildungsroman was. One of them is the Buddenbrooks, Thomas Mann, and the other one is called The Magic Mountain, or Der Zauberberg by Thomas Mann. So these are two novels by Thomas Mann. So I'm not going to do a whole thing on it, but basically if you go to Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time and you look at the second volume, I guess it's the second volume, I hope so. We can check, but I'm not going to check right now. It's called Swan in Love, in which Swan goes through all of the ritual humiliations of falling in love with somebody and what that means. And it's brutal. Like, it's really beautifully written. And this is the thing that you have to know about Proust. Everybody thinks of Proust as being this like highbrow writer, which makes sense. I mean, modernist, he's constantly undermining the idea of narrative authority, blah, blah, blah. But the best way to enjoy Proust, and maybe we should just do this in the live stream here, the best way to enjoy Proust is to read Proust out loud, because Proust is completely satirical. Proust loves ruthlessly, mercilessly making fun of all the little human weaknesses of his characters. And what's beautiful about what Proust does is that he makes fun of them in a way where you laugh about it, but you also know that all those things also apply to you. And so, for example, with Swann falls in love with the, I forgot what her name is, but he falls in love with the female character. She's a really bad piano player, and yet he really, really likes listening to her play the piano. And so Proust like kind of digs into this, like how this person who should know better, right? This is like the sort of bad faith. Je sais, what is it? Je sais bien, mais quand même. I know very well, but Swann knows very well that the woman he loves is a terrible piano player. And yet, when her delicate little hands and fingers are put onto the piano, he loves it. And of course, he's the only person because everybody sees that she's a terrible piano player. And yet to him, those little chords that she plays are just like melting his heart. And this is like a typically Proustian satirical moment, right? Where it's like, love will turn you into just an irrational, complete fool. On the one hand, you think that you're listening to music as you've never experienced music before. And at the same time, you are kidding yourself into believing that this person knows how to play the piano, because the people who aren't in love have exactly zero problem saying, no, that person really sucks at playing the piano. And so that's what Proust does over and over again. He has this really beautifully messed up thing where as long as Swann, the titular character of Swann in Love, as long as Swann thinks that he can have the woman at any time, as long as he thinks that she's more into him than he is into her, he's totally happy. He's totally fine. He can just show up at parties and enjoy flirting with her. But as soon as the tables are turned and she goes and does other things and she doesn't show him that she cares about him, he becomes insanely jealous. And Swann in Love is probably the most brutally honest literary depiction of what jealousy does to an otherwise totally healthy person, right? We're back at Zizek's idea of love being violent, because love will wreak havoc on your mental well-being. And Proust shows this in a way that almost nobody else knows. Like, there's a scene I can sketch you here for a moment. So Swann is in love. He's in love with a woman. And he hears from a friend that she's being seen out and about in Paris, like near the Jardin Luxembourg or whatever, and that she is wearing a hat and carrying flowers. And he tortures himself with this image. He's like, where is she going? Why is she wearing a hat? Does she want to be seen by someone with a hat? Why is she carrying flowers? And he hasn't even admitted to himself that he is in love with her. And yet he's haunted. He's completely tortured by the very idea that she has an internal life that doesn't belong to him. And so what Proust really understands is that love is very much about possession. And it's something, you go back to Aristotle, and Aristotle knows this as well, that one of the dangerous things about love is that you feel like you get to possess that other person, like that person belongs exclusively to you. Roland Barthes says that love is about waiting. It's a waiting game, because lovers are happiest not when they're with their love, feel like they're waiting to be with their love. It's that, like someone said in the comments, blissful agony, that process, that divine madness in which your day-to-day life is just totally upended. So that's basically what we talked about in the beginning of this class. I think, and please tell me if I'm right here, I think that starting next week, next Friday, we should do these live streams in a much more improvised way, where I will take out at random a pile of books, and we can talk about those books one by one. If that's enjoyable to you, I can read my favorite passages to you. We can basically riff, because I think it's enjoyable when thinking is alive. I don't like classes where I'm prepped in advance, where it's like rote. I think it's much more exciting when you watch somebody participate in thought on the fly. So maybe next time we do this, let's just do this again, where we take a random pile of books, like this Godzilla pile over here, and we just sort of you sort of see where it takes us. I think we should do that. So let's try to elevate the riffing game. If you have enjoyed this 45, 50-minute live stream, please consider coming over to my Instagram, where I teach a weekly lecture every Monday. You can start with any class. They all work standalone. You need zero previous experience. You don't have to be an expert on anything, except you have to be alive. You have to have feelings. You have to think about those feelings. You have to enjoy talking about the thinking about feelings and books. And if you come to our lectures, yes, Demid has been our moderator here, so thank you very much, Demid. Shout out to Demid for moderating this live stream. That's hugely useful. If you go to @JenelineJulian on Instagram, Jeneline, who is my wife and best owner of these books, she joins me every Monday for a 1-hour class. Every Monday, 8 a.m. USA Pacific Standard, you can join us. And until then, thank you very, very, very much for helping me figure out what the format for this is going to be. I really enjoyed talking about books. So I think that starting, I don't know, next Friday or whenever I go live again, we should just go through these books and just talk about them. So thanks for being a part of this learning community. It's been my pleasure to teach you today. If you would like to continue this discussion right now, I'm going to be going to Clubhouse, the app Clubhouse. You can find me at the handle @SublimeHysteric, @SublimeHysteric. Now, if you're wondering what or who a sublime hysteric is, this is actually Lacan's way of describing Hegel. He calls him a sublime hysteric. So Demid, if you don't mind, thank you. Could you put in the comments Clubhouse @SublimeHysteric? Thank you again so much for moderating. I am going to go offline right now, and I'm going to go straight into the Clubhouse chat. And you can find me under the handle @SublimeHysteric, and we can have a 1-hour conversation to go with this class. Thank you once again. It's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you for helping me figure this out, and I shall see you all very soon. Thanks again. Bye-bye. And we're going to go off. Let's see. And now, if you're still watching on YouTube, thank you for watching. I still haven't quite figured out what the format for this is going to be, but I really enjoyed talking about some of these books, because for me, that's like, I don't know, these are the books that I live with. These are the books that I sort of read all the time. They're just part of who I am, and I take that for granted. But if it's enjoyable for you to watch me go through these books and talk about them and riff on them and sort of weave the theories together, then please leave a comment or give this a like or follow this channel. It's been my pleasure to do this with you. Thank you for your patience as I figure out the format, and I think we should do this again very soon. All right, see you soon. Bye-bye.